Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. And of course, whether you're watching live or you're catching up with this session on YouTube, welcome once again to another FIPP webinar. Throughout our webinars over the past year and in our presentation to the industry, we've been consistently emphasizing the importance of today's topic. Issues around people, leadership, culture, and diversity are central to a successful transformation to take advantage of the range of digital opportunities now facing every media business across the world. My guest today, who I'll introduce in a moment, is the author of an important new study into this area, and there is a link to download the report in the chat box, so please do take a moment to download it and read it. We're sure that you'll find it very useful, but also you might be able to follow along as we ask the author some questions. Now, before we dive into this subject, let me just run through some housekeeping messages. As ever, we want these sessions to be as interactive as possible, so please do make use of the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to ask questions, and you can also upvote other people's questions, and we'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the event. And of course, we'll put your questions to our guest. A reminder also that today's webinar is being recorded. You can watch the recording of this session, as well as catch up on any others you might have missed on our YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/FIPPworld. A reminder also that if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, please do so. The link is in the chat. It's absolutely the best way to keep abreast of not only the latest industry news, features and reports, but you'll also be able to hear about future webinars and other FIPP events. Please do keep an eye on the chat box as well throughout this event, as we will be posting some useful links as we go along. I think that's enough from me in terms of introduction. It's now time for me to properly introduce my guest for today. Professor Lucy Kung is an experienced strategic advisor, a board member, keynoter, and author. She's non-executive board member of the NZZ Media Group in Switzerland, senior visiting researcher at the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford, and advisory board member of the International Centre for Corporate Governance at the University of St. Gallen. And crucially, for this session, she's the author of this report. So welcome, Lucy.
Hi, great to be here.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Now, this report, the idea of this report was conceived before the COVID crisis came along. So I guess that while COVID has provided a kind of additional dimension to your research, it wasn't the primary motivating factor. What was the primary motivating factor for you undertaking this work?
Frustration. I mean, as an industry, we have been on this digital transformation journey for a quarter of a century. I think progress is slow, and we now all have a strategy. Most organizations have a pretty good strategy. They've got a sense of where the business model is going, but there's a kind of gap between plan and reality. And from working with organizations, from the studies I've been doing, from kind of actually both sides, on one hand, one foot in the academic world research, on the other hand, the other foot in organizations pushing through this, it is the messy internal stuff that is slowing things down. And that is this area that actually the media industry is not particularly interested in, which is around culture, leadership, structure, roles. And I felt if we're going to kind of power through this transformation, and if we're going to stop moving so slowly through this digital transformation journey, we need to really start focusing on that messy stuff in the middle, which is what I tried to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And you open, I mean, very much on that theme, you open the report with a great quote. There's a couple of great quotes in there, but I love this one. It's time to put as much energy into transforming the organization as we do into transforming the product. Now, you could almost characterize this as an organizational gap, could you, for organizations? How much of that do you think the industry has actually built up, an organizational gap?
Yeah, I think that's the bit that's not happening. I mean, essentially, I have no doubt the product transformation will happen. There's so much intrinsic motivation, there's so much passion around making sure that journalism finds its audiences, does what its creators want it to do. But I think what's missing is the understanding that for that to happen in a digital environment, organizations have got to change profoundly. And I mean, long before digital transformation, disruption, Mintzberg, who is one of the greatest strategists of all time, pointed out only 10% of strategies ever gets realized. That's in a normal environment. Once you hit digitization and you look at people like Christensen, they pointed out the majority of organizations never really have a position after disruption, anything like the one they had before. They nearly all slipped down the food chain. And I kind of got the sense that because organizations felt we have a strategy, we're doing something, there was also an assumption, well, we'll get there. And that is really not the case. So I really felt, yes, there is a gap. That gap is common, actually, because I think people don't understand how profoundly difficult this challenge is. You're really changing it from one state into a completely different state.
Just talk us through a little bit about the methodology of the work. How did you kind of derive your conclusions?
Well, I interviewed a lot of people. I mean, I interviewed far more than I intended to or had budgeted to, because actually the findings are really messy. It was really hard to pull out the kind of red threads, as the Germans would put it. So I started off with a set of themes. I did a lot of, initially I did a lot of focus groups, trying to narrow down, have I got these themes right? Did they seem to be the issues that organizations are concerned about or need help with, or are, there's information to cover here? And then what happens then is you start to get these interesting issues that come up and slap you around the face that you weren't looking for, that start turning up everywhere. And the first one of those for this was the profound difference in mindset between generations Y and Z and those at high levels in the organization. And that kept popping up in different incarnations in every single interview. And then obviously I kind of wrote it during COVID, and then COVID changed a lot. So I kind of went back in and I did 100 interviews in total. I did another 30 sort of after lockdown to try and log it. And what was really clear there is that diversity, inclusion, and equity had also they had changed. They were always in the themes, but what was really noticeable, the first round of research, people found it seriously, took it seriously, but felt relatively complacent about it. Yeah, we've nailed this. We have our policies. We know what we're doing, especially after George Floyd. There was this kind of profound realization, we haven't got this at all. So that probably was the biggest shift after COVID, along with this sense of realizing this window for transformation has suddenly got very much smaller. So that the world went digital so fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's been one of the overriding themes of the pandemic. I mean, when you were doing these interviews and these focus groups, did you discover, I mean, we'll dive into some of the specific themes in a minute, but did you discover any kind of variations according to either where the company is based or their kind of heritage in terms of their legacy business? Were there any variations in experience there?
Not really. I mean, one of the difficulties in doing these pieces of research, writing these kinds of books, that I'm really aware of is every single organization is completely context independent. It's really hard to come up with kind of recipes. And there are successes in small countries with minority languages. There are successes in big country with dominant languages. It's very hard to pull hard and fast rules. What I did become fascinated by, however, is the strength of the Scandinavian Nordic players. And my pet theory is it's to do with the national culture, which is very low hierarchy, which means by extension, innovation, I think, is easier in those organizations. I was talking to someone about it a couple of weeks ago, and she described it, I don't know if there are any Norwegians on this call, but as kind of low shoulders, high ceilings. So it's very easy for ideas to float around. People feel quite comfortable presenting ideas regardless of level. And that is one of the patterns I'm seeing, but I wouldn't say I've researched it to a point I can say that's definitely a finding.
Is that pattern a worry? I mean, is that because national culture is not very easy to transplant, is it? So is there a danger in this that it may be impossible in certain circumstances to make this kind of transformation?
I think culture is the big worry. I mean, I was talking to David Rogers, who's the kind of digital transformation guru at Columbia in New York, and he does the same as I do, but he does across all industries. I tend to just do media. And we both agreed at the end of the day, it's all about culture, actually. So the thicker your culture and the more you've got elements in the national culture, in the professional culture, in the organizational culture, the harder it is to cut through.
Absolutely.
So to an extent, yes, the odds are stacked a little bit higher against.
Yeah, we're going to dive into leadership at the moment, but we've had a question from the audience already, which if you don't mind, I'll take now, from John Wilpers, who's the author of our innovation book, who's asking, what or who is the biggest roadblock to transformation? Is it the leadership, the staff, and how do you convert them to believers?
Hi, John. Really good question. I think to bastardize Tolstoy, every organization is unhappy in its own way. It's got its own roadblocks. What is really clear, though, is in terms of this transformation, it has to be led from the top. They have to really prime the pump, make the priorities really, really clear, and keep reinforcing them. If that's not happening, if it's kind of delegated to a kind of digital savvy layer below that, the problem is they will burn out because they don't have the authority to change the culture of the whole organization. So I think it to some extent it is the culture, but then what happens after that really depends on the setup of the organization, I think. I mean, a lot of people did say, oh, we've got this kind of stodgy middle inside the organization. The top get it, the bottom get it, and there's this middle that don't change. But that's absolutely not across the board. And I think one of the problems with that layer in the middle is they're getting less input. You know, a lot of it is about the mindset shift, and that comes in the amount of data points you've got. If people at the top are having a lot of interaction with other people in the industry, watching best practice, they will be kind of quietly changing them, developing their mindset the whole time. Those at the bottom are fresher and newer. And the ones in the middle have really got very difficult jobs to do, huge workloads. It's harder for them to get that kind of input from the outside.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that as well in a minute when we talk about the generations as well, because I think that's a crucial part of it. But you mentioned leadership and the fact that it has to be driven from the top. In the report, you start with leadership, and it's very much the first chapter. You highlight 5 behaviors that leaders need to display. And I want to narrow in on one of them, which is this fantastic concept, another great quote, of high thinking, low ego. What is this? How is that different from the mindset that's being shown by leaders at the moment?
Yeah, this is very kind of Zen-like. And to be frank, it requires a huge amount of kind of personal maturity. In fact, to have authority, to be senior, but also to be very open about what you don't know, and to be, open about sharing what you don't know. I think the issue is essentially strategy. Because of the kind of volatility, the pace of change, the number of uncertainties, strategy has to become emergent now. No leader can now have all the answers. So what the best they can do is make smart assumptions and then anchor those assumptions in kind of trial and learning. And the other issue is that a whole lot of new critical knowledge is now centered in the bottom, sort of new areas of the organization, tend to be younger areas of the organization that almost by definition, those at the top are not across. They can't be. They kind of came in the last, 7-10 years, product, data analytics, all of these kind of new areas. So we're kind of moving away from a position where it makes any sense for the person at the top to take all the decisions. They've really got to have a good team, good information networks inside the organization. And they also have to be tremendously transparent about what they don't know, because that's the only way they can acquire that knowledge. And if they are open about that, then they kind of force everyone else to modify up as well. One of the really great CEOs said to me, if I'm not honest about my change journey, what I don't know, my need to change, the fact that I'm having to learn all this stuff, then I can't really expect anyone else in the organization to do it too. And conversely, the more public I am about that, the more I kind of activate everyone else to do that. And then the faster we evolve.
Yeah, so absolutely enforcing the message that it's not a sign of weakness to say that you don't know something.
No, it's about these horrible psycho buzzwords about kind of vulnerability and accessibility and transparency, but it actually is about that. If you can extract the kind of buzzy annoyingness of them, it is really about being very open about what you've got to learn, but also it's kind of trusting people, I think, with less traditional careers inside the organization, newer members, younger members, because they really, if you've got to trust your judgment in hiring them, and then you've got to give them the authority to make the decisions they were hired to do.
John has asked a follow-up question. He's on fire this morning. He says, okay, if it's the top, how do they specifically incentivize the people on the bottom and the middle? Or do they need incentivizing at all, the people on the bottom and the middle?
John, incentivize to do what?
To change.
Well, they kind of, if the strategic goals are clear, if the OKRs and the KPIs are clear, actually, in a way, you're requiring change, right? And then essentially what you're doing is requiring and empowering and supporting everyone else to do whatever is necessary to make those changes.
Yeah. You highlighted there one CEO that you interviewed who sounded like he or she had the right attitude. Do you think it's the case, though, that we need to think about new leadership for media businesses, or do you see evidence that the existing leadership is capable of adapting?
I think what is really critical actually is the leadership team. If you take the complexity of the challenge, if you take the fact that essentially the big kind of narrow story arc in our industry over the last 20 years has been the ascendancy of technology. You know, the fact that so much of what we're doing is based around software engineering, actually. You need new skills in that top team. So what becomes really important, and often, sorry, just to backtrack, those top teams have kind of grown up historically. They're kind of old roles, people have got to the top, they're bits, companies you've acquired or whatever. So it's not like, say, you're a clean sheet organization, a VC organization, a private equity. You'd come and you'd look at the team, you'd assess people, you'd work out the roles. You've kind of got this inherited group of individuals who may or may not be fit for the strategic task you've got. And actually, I think that is where a very difficult piece of analytic and cultural work is needed. You need to look at all of those roles, and some of them have changed a lot, like the shift from publisher to chief marketing officer or chief commercial officer. That is an enormous change in that role. So you've got, you need data knowledge up there, product knowledge up there. So there's a challenge at the top of really looking at all of those roles at the top, making sure they're completely right for where your strategy needs to go. Then assuming you've got the right roles, the right people in those roles, you've also got to look really hard at how well they play together. Are they pulling together as a team? Because that was really clear talking to people. There's a disproportionate improvement if they really pull together. And if they don't, you basically slow everything down. But that's very, very hard to tackle because it becomes also a very kind of personal, intimate challenge as well, sort of correcting things that aren't quite right at that level.
Yeah, and having those difficult conversations that nobody really likes to have.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of what happened in the media industry is because they didn't want to have those conversations. There's this assumption, well, we'll let it ride for a few years and then it'll take care of itself. And actually the opportunity cost of that letting it ride proved to be really, really significant.
And you can see the opportunity cost in the success of the companies that have done it and have done well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to someone yesterday about, growth during COVID, and the mean growth in subs for organizations with a paywall during COVID is actually something like 58% across the industry. But, the organizations that pulled off that growth, they are the ones that had this mechanism in place before. So they've done all of this difficult work.
You mentioned earlier on the aspect of this, which is company culture, and much has been written in recent years about the importance of building the right culture. Do you think companies really, truly, especially media companies, truly understand how to do this?
It's incredibly hard. I mean, if you take the assumption, basically, the culture of an organization is like the personality of an individual, how hard it is to change anyone's personality, right? What you're trying to do is 100-fold, 1,000-fold when you change culture. So incredibly difficult, and without doubt, that's the single largest pain point. People are most concerned about that culture in terms of roadblocks. But the second really difficult thing is they have this kind of sense of powerlessness. How do we change culture? We're not going to be able to do that. And essentially, what is really clear is getting culture right is not rocket science. It's the fact it shouldn't be viewed as a standalone project. Essentially, you need to be very clear. You need to have some kind of clarity of what kind of cultural values do we really need and how are they different to what we've got now. And then you need to kind of screen every single thing you're doing in the organization to see, is it reinforcing the values we want, or is it actually undermining those? And so what you're looking at are many, many micro changes throughout the organization to make sure that really everything you're doing is pushing towards creating the same culture. But of course, that's really, really hard. It's much easier if you start with a clean sheet of paper. You can build the culture you want.
And how do you think companies have been able to do that during COVID? Is it multiplied the problem?
I think it has, because I think you've got fewer touch points to really interact, because you see, I mean, if you look at diversity, equity, inclusion, that's to some extent a culture problem. You need to change mindsets. Bias is an issue of mindset. And the problem is a lot of the really critical work needs to be done at a kind of micro level. It's in the meetings. It's who gets to talk, who doesn't get to talk, how do people react to certain people's comments. And to some extent, yeah, you can organize that better on in a Zoom call. But you have got fewer options to actually influence the culture because there's less culture that people are experiencing. Yeah. And I think the other thing I've seen in some organizations during COVID is because of the level of exhaustion, people are kind of reverting back to the old culture. So one of the CEOs I spoke to said, culture's like a piece of elastic. The minute you stop pulling on it, it snaps back. And I think there has been a lot of snapping back during COVID.
Yeah.
And there was, especially at the beginning, a kind of dangerous loop where there was this kind of return to traditional old, especially in broadcasting, legacy programs. People thought, we can forget that digital stuff. Actually, they love us after all again.
Yeah.
So there is, I think that's self-corrected now. But yeah, I think COVID has made the culture change piece more difficult. But I think the positive thing in COVID is that people are unfrozen. Yeah. People are expecting things to be different. And that is an amazing gift, actually, because the toughest thing in culture change is actually that first stage where you have to unfreeze the organization and make people open to doing things differently. That's all the kind of burning platform rhetoric that never really works. But what you've got actually is essentially a completely unique situation where everyone is expecting things to be very different and kind of open to things being done differently. Plus, people have seen it can be done differently. I mean, people have made phenomenal changes, and some has been mucky, but a lot of it has really worked. Yeah. So I think it's a very good place to actually start changing culture right now.
So COVID has given a sort of free pass to do some change, or to embrace the idea of change. I'm going to come on in a minute and ask you about the levers, the cultural change levers that you can pull in an organization. But we've got another question from Jose Valero Pastor. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks for your question. Who's asking about this question of transforming the talent in the organization. And his question is, do you think new digital media businesses have a better chance to succeed than legacy media businesses because they can add new talent without having to pay the layoff costs of talent in the existing business that may not be able to adapt? So in other words, what's the HR overhead of having a legacy media business in terms of the willingness to change?
I think, in terms of, if you just look at that narrow funnel of talent, definitely. I think what you also have to look at, though, if you kind of broaden it out, it depends on the resources of the new organization and how much scale they can get to. I mean, one of the kind of wicked challenges at the moment is scale in the media. The media have no scale. They've grown up with this title mass media, but actually they are now minnows in comparison to the organizations they are competing with. Strategically speaking, they have no scale anymore. That's the problem for startups, to scale fast. And that's really only going to work, I think, if they can be a platform business, which is not easy to do. And I think the second thing is very hard for them in this distributed environment is to kind of land their brands. And that's one of the big assets that legacy media have. They have these brands that people know and often love. So I'm not sure. Yeah, there is advantage in the talent area, definitely. There's an advantage in terms of being able to build culture, but they're going to need to scale. They're going to need to really anchor a brand. That's not so easy.
Yeah, I mean, during the Congress, we described media as being a big industry that's still coming to terms with being a medium-sized industry, and it sounds as though that's certainly true. I want to come back to this idea of culture change levers, which you talk about in the report. Just tell us what the key ones are for those people who do want to pull them and their relative importance. I mean, what would be the top one?
The top one is the leadership. If they're not signaling this, nothing's going to happen, and you will actually burn out anyone else who's trying to do it. So basically, they have to be there, and they have to really visibly have the back of anyone else trying to change the culture. And what's really critical for the leaders, it's not just the overt signaling, it's the passive signaling. So it's who they don't promote, which projects they don't take further. It's who they start talking to, who people wouldn't expect them to talk to. So they've got to be, it's like, if you're trying to get fit, you're either building muscle or you're losing it. There is no negative place in terms of leadership signaling around culture. They've got to make sure everything they do, and people are disproportionately looking at leaders. They're looking at every single thing they do and trying to decode it. So they've got to be hyper vigilant on that. The second one is actually data. In fact, once you start to get really intelligent data coming into the organization and even more intelligent discussions around that, then what you find is you get this kind of self-correction mechanism coming in terms of, product market fit, which is, that's a kind of product concept, but that's essentially what you're trying to get. Because what happens is, organizations inevitably, into the culture is anchored all kinds of assumptions about what we do for our audiences, what our audiences want. Inevitably, those have dated. And of course, they've dated. If you look at how violently the world has changed since we've been in the kind of platform, social, mobile world. And basically, once you get data into newsrooms, people start to see actually where their audiences are, what they're really caring about, what they're interested in. And if you kind of marry that up with the kind of passion inside organizations to create content, then actually you find the culture self-correcting. So data is essentially, I think it's one of the biggest culture change tools there are, but actually it is really not easy getting those data tools really into kind of living out reality of newsrooms. That is a cultural challenge in itself. So I think those are the two biggest ones, actually.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, there are a load more in the report. Please do have a read of that chapter. It's really illustrative and instructive, I think. But one of the most fascinating chapters of the report for me was the one about managing and working across different generations. And I love talking about this subject. Just tell me how differently, and I'm going to ask you some difficult questions. Just tell me how differently, first of all, Gen Y and Gen Z view the workplace.
I think it's a really profoundly different mindset. I think it's a really promising mindset. I think it's really positive. So first thing to say is this is not a point of conflict or tension. This actually is a point of leverage. But I really tried to kind of map this, and it is a combination of points of difference. The first factor is very strong personal belief system, very strong personal value set. And what's very interesting about that is they are looking for their work, the values of their organization to be in harmony, to be congruent with their personal values. And I think what's really notable about this group is if push comes to shove, if there's conflict, they will choose in favor of their personal values. They're not prepared to compromise on their personal values. So I think that's one really important point. So I think a lot of business assumptions around the fact, well, we're paying them, they'll knuckle under in the end. That is really not the case. That personal value set is tremendously important. Second thing that really stands out is very high in kind of psychological jargon, self-actualization needs. This is a group on a learning journey. They want to acquire skills, they want to acquire knowledge, they want to be exposed to opportunities for learning, they're very curious, they want to work in a collaborative way. They're looking for momentum, they're looking for movement. And I think the third one that is really not in all countries, but in a lot of countries, is actually they're in a different economic situation than many of their bosses or their bosses were at their point in their career. Often they kind of graduated into the financial crisis, maybe they had student debts, they've only known this industry as a economically challenged industry. Many will have been laid off more than their bosses or their bosses' bosses will ever have been. So they see, to some extent, there is a personal cost for working in this industry. And to that extent, it's important that it meets their needs, that it's congruent with what they need, because otherwise this sacrifice isn't worth it. And I think for a lot of them, especially the talented ones, there is a real concern around the fact, will I ever be able to own my own home if I continue to work in journalism or whatever? And I think that is a really serious consideration that is kind of perhaps underappreciated by people near the top who actually just had a completely different employment arrangement.
Yeah. Now, relevant question for many of our viewers today, most of whom will not be baby boomers or millennials. They're good old Gen Xers who always get forgotten about in this kind of thing. Is that give them some hope? Is that cohort, the Gen X cohort, destined to just be jumped over and forgotten as we transition from baby boomers to millennials?
No,
because they don't get mentioned in any single, not just your research, but any research that comes along. Gen X gets forgotten, right?
I'm right. But I mean, I think that's about marketing and publicity, and it's kind of more, it's a kind of new thing, right? All these generations. It's at root, kind of your age is irrelevant. It's to do with your mindset, it's to do with your skills, it's actually to do with how curious you are and how open you are. And in fact, I've seen amazing people who are 80, I've seen amazing people who are 20 at the kind of very senior level. I think it's a little bit what I was looking at in terms of the kind of people they're hiring for. It goes across the board. People are looking for people who can solve problems and bring organizations forward, complex problems, and bring people with them. And I think that's kind of age irrelevant. So no, do not fear.
And another challenging question for you. If you're a baby boomer, you would say, well, this kind of generational clash is not new. I mean, in the 1960s, everybody had personal values and that was what dictated what they did. Is there something unique about what we're experiencing now, or is this just the same generational clash that there is every 50 or so years repeated?
I couldn't say, actually. I couldn't say, but it is a thing. It is a thing. And, what is really clear is certainly with the new skill areas, the new competencies, these kind of hybrid areas, they really are the key to the future. And it will be a complete tragedy if for some reason those voices aren't heard, they're not able to turn that key.
Yeah.
And I think that is about being open and kind of acknowledging different perspective. But this is the group you want to unleash on a problem to solve, right? Amazing energy, amazing commitment, amazing open-mindedness. So in a way, they are absolutely the kind of fuel you need inside your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on now to a really important topic, which is the question of diversity. Never been more important, never been more high profile. We've spoken often at FIPP events about the economic imperative too, of not cutting yourself off from the new customers and new sources of talent. But do you see evidence that media companies are taking diversity seriously?
Yes, I do. And I have discussions with people at the Institute about this. I must say, on the basis of this research, I do. What was very interesting, though, is what I said at the beginning. The first round of research, people were taking it seriously but thought they'd nailed it. After the summer, after George Floyd, people realized they really hadn't. And it's a bit like, if you do any type of academic study, there's that phase right at the beginning where you realize how little you know. And I think that was the kind of journey that happened with diversity, inclusion, and equity. Once people really started to engage with it, once they'd done all the cosmetic stuff, a chief diversity officer, put up a few awards, and then they'd realized actually no needles were being moved anywhere inside the organization. They started to probe into how we change it. Then I think they realized this is much, much harder than they was thought. And in fact, what I feel a lot of organizations is this tension between pressure, especially coming from the top. We've got to move on this, we've got to show we're moving. And the people who are running the programs really getting frustrated because there's no understanding at the top how difficult this is and how essentially is a cultural issue. It's a power issue. People with the power have got to be very happy to give away that power. And the closer you get to the top, the harder that becomes, actually.
Yeah. I mean, we ran a few sessions on diversity during the Congress, and the question that got asked in almost all of them was, how do we do this? What's the levers that we pull, particularly if you're not a big multinational organization? So just going back to your idea of change levers and cultural change levers, what are the key ones, do you think, in addressing diversity?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do, and you have to really flag this up, this is a long-term problem. It's a systemic problem. You're not going to have any you can have some fast wins, but real change, it needs a really kind of concerted program of effort throughout the whole organization. Clearly, first step is at the top. It's got to be very clear. This has to happen, but also it's everyone's responsibility. You can't just delegate this to some poor soul in HR who's got to get it together. It's like digital. Do you remember when Marty Barron said we've taken digital off the titles because everyone's digital? It's like the same has to happen with diversity. Everyone is individually responsible for moving the needle on this. Measurement is really critical. And it's not just measuring who's coming in, but it's measuring who's coming in, how long they're staying, how are they moving across cohorts? Is there one cohort that's just not progressing as fast? And also some organizations are doing really clever surveying, kind of quick and dirty, very kind of low frictions. How comfortable do you feel in your team? How comfortable do you feel in the big meetings? So data is important. Internal networks are incredibly important. So joining up underrepresented groups so they can mentor each other, they can act as advocates, they can articulate needs more clearly. And then I think, obviously, there's a lot of work about changing the on-ramp, which is really, really important. And there's been fascinating stuff going on about that, especially in the US, I found, where people are really deconstructing job roles completely. So taking off all education, just listing the skills we need and being very, very open about where you go looking for those skills. A number of organizations are no longer looking at the classic journalism schools or the classic universities, trying to move to other places. But I think one of the tricky things, coming back to your point about COVID and culture, often this is about the microclimate. There's this term in microaggressions.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting when you dig into those. I did a lot of groups just on diversity and inclusion. And it's really interesting what a member of an underrepresented group can perceive of as exclusionary or painful or toxic. The individual who made that comment can be flabbergasted. So there's a lot of work that's got to be done in the individual meetings to kind of increase understanding there. And that's a very subtle work, and it's very hard to do remote. And that's why there's a kind of culture change. So I think I lay that out in the book. There's a kind of map of what has to be looked at.
Yeah.
But I think the main thing is being really, really clear that this is a major undertaking and it's everyone's job.
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout the report, you've got a number of examples for each chapter. The one that you use for diversity is the BBC's 50/50 project, an initiative that's been successful, initiative that we've featured on FIPP and that we're proud to support at FIPP. Not only in the BBC as an organisation itself, but now spread out across the wider industry. Is that a model that you recommend, a framework that you recommend?
Well, I think that's a really significant initiative in terms of actually its societal impact, its cultural impact. Because I think if you're seeing different people on screen, if you're hearing different people on air, that is tremendously powerful for shifting kind of broader attitudes. And I think there's a lot to learn, which is what I kind of flagged up in the book about how they did that, which is that it came from someone inside the newsroom, and a white male inside the newsroom was really upset about this. It was completely opt-in. No one had to join it. So basically, there were issues in the way that was approached that was very, very clever in terms of working with the culture, getting kind of cultural acceptance. And I think that's the point to make clear about that. Really, it was the kind of cleverness with which it was designed, and the fact that it was a kind of organic initiative from inside the organization.
Yeah, I remember we went to see, it was I've forgotten his name, Ross
Atkins.
Atkins. We went to see Ross Atkins not long after he launched it, and it struck me that it was incredible. Having worked at the BBC for 12 years, I know how hard it is to get anything going, and to get something like that off the ground as a grassroots initiative is an incredible achievement, I think.
I think the other thing that was great about that, which is picks up on the data point, is that data is coming back very fast.
Yeah,
it's coming back as soon as the program is launched. They're getting the data back, which means there isn't this kind of gap, 3 months reporting interval, 6 months reporting interval. So you can, these feedback loops, which is what makes the platforms, it's what make Google and Facebook so amazingly powerful. Those are really, really important, actually, internally as well as in terms of audiences.
Well, he described the data as the crucial factor in seeing its widespread adoption across the BBC, because as soon as one department reported, the next department wanted to make sure that they weren't missed out the next time. And so they made every effort to achieve the target. And it was that consistent reporting of the targets across all the departments of the BBC that led to the initiative being adopted as widely as it has been. So really good proof there of the power of data. Anyway, we're going to move on to the final section in a moment on talent. Before we do, just a reminder that in the chat there's some information about some forthcoming sessions that we've got. I'll tell you more about that later. The first one of our DIS sessions on the 9th of March is about this very topic of people and leadership and culture, and we've got a couple of guests from Meredith joining us to talk about that. A reminder also that you can ask questions of Lucy either now or at the end of the session, so don't forget to put those in the Q&A box as we go along. Lucy, the final section of the report looks at talent and the need to bring in new skills and a new mindset. This is something one of our delegates asked a little bit earlier. Again, a great quote at the beginning of that section where somebody says, "We haven't got people leaving enough to open up new positions." So what extent is that lack of mobility, which I guess is driven by the general uncertainty in the industry, affecting media companies' ability to bring in new talent and promote existing talent, which is kind of the question that Jose was asking earlier?
I think it is an issue. It's really an issue. It's a structural issue. It's an issue also for diversity and inclusion. There's very little movement in these organizations at the moment. And, if you look back to kind of, 2017, 18, there were people kind of adding social departments and digital departments and whatever. That's all stopped. And the closer you get to the top, the more people tend to be clinging onto their seats. So I think that is really a problem, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that could be done to improve that mobility? Is there a lever that a company can pull there?
No, I don't think there is, but I have seen some clever things, particularly around kind of, finding development paths when there are actually no jobs opening up. Whereas, for example, a company in Scandinavia. So when a senior person goes on holiday for 2-3 weeks, a more junior person officially is raised to that role for 2 or 3 weeks, just so they get a chance to move up a level, to understand a higher role, to kind of expand their talents, get something for their CV. So I think there's kind of proxies you can find, but essentially, no, it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk about recruitment in a minute, but I've got a couple of questions here from the audience on training, which is relating to this point. One from John and one from Christian Sanchez. Thank you, Christian, for watching. I'll read out Christian's question, which is more or less the same as John's. Assuming that competing with tech companies is difficult, which we're going to come on to in a minute in terms of talent acquisition, how do you think media organizations in general terms are facing their continuous training challenges? So in other words, building skills within the organization.
I think it's really hard to say. And to be honest, I didn't research in-depth training, what's happening. My sense is that skills gap is not so much around the digital skills, actually. I think they're there and I think they can be found. I think the challenge is actually around the fact that in the middle of the organization now, a lot of people need to be actually incredibly good leaders as well. And often that's not what they joined for, that's not what they signed up for. But, the burden of realizing a lot of the transformation strategies is now landing on the people in the middle, making sure their teams deliver. That requires skills in feedback, in coaching, in mentoring, and performance management that has never been needed to that extent before. So actually, I think that's where the support is needed, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do a shameless plug and say that FIPP's new FIPP training business has a whole range of courses that might be suitable for this kind of thing. So if you're looking for training solutions, you know where to come. But let's move on to the question which was alluded to there about recruitment. So you highlight 4 key attributes that make for an attractive hire: proactivity, a growth mindset, being able to handle ambiguity, and leadership. Now that sounds like a great ideal employee, but how easy is it for us as media businesses to attract talent like this versus a startup, a big tech company, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think you can attract them. I mean, the problem here, the subtext here is actually what you're saying is you want an entrepreneurial mindset. And you can find them, and the hirers can say this individual is great, but then the rest of the organization has got to make scope for them, make space for them to kind of act that out. So then you end up looping back to the culture again. So yeah, I think you can find those people, and I think they're terrific. And that's also creates opportunity for different types of people to come into the organization. I think that's fantastic. But the bigger problem is actually sinking them into the rest of the organization and letting them kind of do their stuff. Yeah.
I mean, this idea of entrepreneurs, I mean, if you think about the entrepreneurial mindset and why somebody joins or starts a startup, of course, half or more than half the motivation is the desire to create a new product and all those, and the flexibility and agility and all those kind of things that you've talked about in the culture. Isn't the other side of it the financial motivation at the end of it as well? Is that something that organizations need to look to if they want to encourage an entrepreneurial mindset?
No, I don't. I think it's about wanting growth, wanting movement, wanting to create something, wanting to, I mean, what you often see is these people have a very clear sense of what the problem is and what the solution is. And we've seen that in a lot of organizations. There's a group of people, it's like a boiled egg, right? You just cut off the top, let them rise, they would solve the problems.
Yeah.
And I think, so no, I don't think it's about that. And
the solution is the motivation.
Yeah, I think it's giving the scope. But I think there is a lot of friction. It's very difficult to be inside a very staid organization if you think like that, even if you've been hard to think like that.
Is it difficult also to blend those kind of people with a traditional media business? You may have we have a number of members, for example, who are very successful at combining a traditional print media business, let's say, or print and digital media business with a venture capital or an entrepreneurial arm. I mean, is that a challenge, having those two different types of cultures? Does one interact with the other?
No, it doesn't have to be. I mean, but it really depends on the culture, which is set by the leader. It's the messages that are coming from the top about how much this matters.
Yeah. One of the features of the market, and something you talk about a lot in the report, is the emergence of what you call blended journalists. Another fantastic phrase. Tell us what a blended journalist is, and tell us why they're so valuable.
Well, the even better term is platypus, which I
platypus. Yes, I wasn't sure if we would get platypus, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, these are the hybrid roles. So there's a degree of tech combined with a kind of anchoring in journalism. So it's design, it's engineering, it's mixed media, it's data analytics, it's product, right? So essentially what we've seen over the last, I guess, 15 years, especially as we had the kind of social mobile layer added to our industry, that increasingly for digital products to find digital audiences, it's completely contingent on these roles, in fact. So they are the future, but often they've been bolted on and they're not really properly integrated. And a lot of people, frankly, don't really understand what these individuals are doing and why they matter so much and what language they're speaking, which makes it very difficult for those individuals holding the roles. They're not delivering what they can. So you can get kind of a vicious circle kicking in here. And in fact, I do see consistently across the last 3 books I've done, the highest turnovers in these individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you want more detail on what a platypus is or a blended journalist is, then please do have a look at that section of the report. It's quite an interesting section, because you will know somebody in your organization who is like that. And let's just close, before I ask you to give some practical takeaways, let's close with the last bit, which is the challenge that this creates for everybody's favorite department, HR. What kicking can we give to our poor HR departments as a result of all of this?
We don't give them any kicking, James. It is such a bad habit to be rude about HR. And essentially, what you see in the stronger organizations is they've completely rethought this. What that team, that aspect of the organization is doing is building an organization that's capable of delivering on the strategy, right? That's what they should be. But we kind of structurally under-index it, right? We give them too little power, give them too few resources, very junior people. They end up just doing admin, which reinforces this sense these are nasty bureaucrats. So, and then it never rises. And consistently, if you look at the strongest players, they have got what I call the super HR on the board. Really high powered person in lockstep with the CEO, who can answer back to the CEO, who is there to make sure the organization has the right culture, the right talent, the right structure, all of the kind of mucky internal stuff. Yeah. That is not happening. Yeah. But as soon as you see a dotted line, as soon as you see HR coming in dotted line to finance, this organization is not going to move anywhere very fast, frankly.
So HR genuinely still exists as a function. It's not something that's distributed to the departments as part of the corporate culture?
In stronger organizations, it's being massively built out. Actually, if you look at all of those playing in the top league, they've brought in really, really strong people up there right now. Yeah. And it's been, of course, a big feature of companies like Google, in the way that they treat people. If you look at Eric Schmid's biographies or Nadella from Microsoft, it's all about culture. It's all about people. I mean, one of the problems, weirdly, is what we call this. HR is the kiss of death. People and ops, which is what Google calls it, just sounds very mechanistic. But it is about designing an internal organization that will deliver on the external goals. And the more seriously that's taken, the more likely you are to meet those goals. Yeah. So it's really time, as someone said to me, to find a less shitty sounding name for this role, because it is actually central to everything. Personnel? No, I don't know. I'll give a free signed copy of the book to anyone who comes up with a good. Oh, there we go. Okay, there's a challenge. Free autographed copy of Lucy's book for anybody who can come up with a better name than HR. There's a challenge. Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Well, we've nearly run out of time, Lucy. We've been talking for nearly an hour. We've answered all of our audience questions as we've gone along, so that's fantastic. I'm just going to ask you to close, though, by giving our viewers 1 or 2 practical takeaways. What can they go off and do immediately after this session, apart, of course, from reading the report? Of course. It's a tiny little report, very little. Okay, 2 things. If from an organizational perspective, audit your leadership. Check the top team is strong enough, which means, do you have the right roles? Are they scoped right? Have you got the right people in them? And are they playing nicely together? Are they pulling together as a team? Second thing, personally, I think this has been a terrible year, but this is one of the most plastic, fluid times I have ever seen. So I think this is really time to cut through professionally. And I would really, at an individual level, I would aim to do that. And I think the way to do that is to differentiate yourself. And I think it's really important for everyone to find their niche and own it. Because I think if you do that and if you build out your platform on that basis, there are kind of extraordinary opportunities at the moment. You can kind of move anywhere.
Absolutely. Fantastic. That's a great place to end on. Audit your leadership and cut through and differentiate yourself. Fantastic. Two great pieces of advice. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for that immensely entertaining chat. Another link in the chat has gone in there to download the report. So please, those of you who have not already done so, please do so. I know we'll be checking afterwards to see who did and who didn't. But Lucy, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate you taking the time to come and join.
You're most welcome. It was a pleasure. And to everyone, reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Very happy to continue the conversation.
And we have some feedback there from Ritu Kanduri. Thank you very much. An incredible session. Thanks. There you go. Fabulous. Just before we go, everybody, a few pieces of housekeeping. There is a post-webinar survey for you to fill in, which will get sent to you automatically. Please do tell us whether you enjoyed this session and whether you would recommend it. A couple of other things coming up soon. We have the DIS webinars, which have been linked to in the chat. Please do sign up for those. They're free to members and only €99 to non-members for the whole series. We have the new direct-to-consumer event happening in June. Check the website for details of that, but our new event focused on recurring revenue and digital subscriptions and all those good things around reaching your consumers. If you haven't already done so, sign up for the newsletter, follow us on Twitter, @FIPPCEO and @FIPPWorld. And a reminder that, of course, the paywall will be going up, membership wall will be going up on the FIPP website very, very soon. So you will need to follow some new instructions as to how to access content after that date. But we're going to be back in a few weeks' time with the first DIS session with our guests from Meredith talking once again about people, culture and leadership, looking at how they do that on People Magazine and Real Simple Magazine. So please do join us then. For the meantime, though, thank you very much for watching and we will see you all again soon. Thank you and goodbye.